Under the crystal chandelier, time narrowed to a single line of motion, a raised hand, a wrist twisting in the air, a small cloud of perfume trailing behind it. The room held its breath, the house staff, the guests, the marble itself. The air smelt faintly of lemon polish and expensive soap. Then a hand closed on the raised wrist. It was not the fast, practiced grab of a security guard. It was a plain, steady hand, fingers warm and calloused, holding another hand back from its intended strike. The fingers belonged to Amaka, the new maid. She looked up at the woman she had stopped and found a face made rigid with entitlement. Around them, the room exhaled in shock. Clarissa Benson recoiled as if the hand had shocked her. Her lips were a thin red line. Her nails flashed like small knives. She had been a storm all evening, sharp laughter, sharper commands, but no one in that house had expected resistance. Certainly not from a girl who had arrived with a single bag and a patient, unremarkable way of moving through rooms. A servant's instinct is to duck, to apologize before the words are even necessary. Today, those instincts failed. For a moment, everything was possible and strange. A maid holding the wrist of the woman who would become the mistress of the house. Chica Anderson stood in the doorway, his silhouette cut against the cold light of the foyer. He had been returning from a late meeting. His coat still held the city's rain on one sleeve. He saw the hand on Clarissa's wrist and the sudden hush that came after. Normally, he would have stepped forward and smoothed things with a gracious sentence. Instead, he stood very still. The look he gave Amaka was not of surprise so much as of sudden recognition. There is courage, sometimes, in people you had only ever seen as background. Someone whispered, and the whisper spread, like a thin thread of gossip someone had freed. But in that hush, something larger uncoiled. The world of the mansion, with its invisible rules and measured humiliations, had been punctured. The raised hand did not fall. The chandelier glinted. Stay until the end to see how one act changed everything. 3 weeks earlier, Amaka had stepped off a bus into a town that smelled of oil and cassava, and from there she had walked with a small, steady load toward an address that meant a month's wages and the chance to send money home. She had learned early not to make demands on a life that had given her small returns. Her village had been patient and poor. Her father fixed shoes, her mother tended the garden. There were debts to be eased, a brother to keep in school, a sister who had started to cough last season. When the job came through a neighbor who knew the house manager, Amaka went, not because she expected to change the world, but because the world she knew needed bread. The mansion was a place built of mirrored surfaces and silent corridors. It occupied a block like an argument, polished stone and iron gates, a fountain that sighed in the central courtyard. Staff moved along its veins with practiced humility, footsteps softened, eyes lowered. The lives of the occupants were held in the precise rituals of raising curtains, serving plates, pressing shirts. The staff's quarters were at once intimate and invisible. Low ceilings, thin mattresses, enough light to read by. They shared tea in the mornings and quiet jokes in the evenings, never quite certain when kindness might be mistaken for insubordination. Clarissa Benson arrived into that house like someone planting a flag. Fiancée to Chica Anderson, who everyone agreed could have married cheap and still been happy, she was instead a carefully selected taste. Designer coats, manicured impatience, a laugh that often rounded into a command. Her voice had a way of making people shrink without touching them. The staff learned the small rules that would keep them safe. Never meet her gaze for longer than necessary. Never answer before you are spoken to. Always darken your step when she is near. Chica, by contrast, moved like a man who had kept his feet on ground others elevated. He was generous in private ways. An unexpected cup of porridge on rainy mornings for the cooks. A joke in the kitchen that made one of the junior chefs grimace and laugh, and patience in public. He carried his wealth uncluttered by spectacle. His kindness did not clamor for notice. When he laughed, it was like a door opening. Clarissa did not so much lead the house as electrify it. Her expectations were precise and often cruel. Jewelry had to be placed on cushions, robes had to be fluted in just the right way. When anything fell out of place, she turned her sharpness outward. An unruly curtain became evidence of laziness. A slightly faded teacup was a sign of disrespect. When a plate arrived with a hairline chip, the room tightened, and the person closest to the kitchen felt the cold press of her anger. Amaka watched all of this from the edges. She listened more than she spoke. Her work was clean and exact. She made beds so smooth they seemed to breathe. She polished cutlery until it looked like another kind of mirror. And she learned the lines of the house in a manner that felt like a small, useful map. She noticed where each guest liked to sit, who preferred black coffee, and who asked for lemon. But it was impossible not to notice Clarissa. Clarissa filled rooms like a punctuation mark. She could be charming when the hour rewarded charm, quick smiles at charity galas, tight-lipped praise when it suited her image, but she could be merciless with the staff. The staff told stories about Clarissa in the way people tell small, sharp myths, whispering about orders given with a glance, about a hung coat left in public as a lesson, about a shower turned off midstream in plain punishment. Amaka watched all of this from the edges. She listened more than she spoke. Her work was clean and exact. She made beds so smooth they seemed to breathe. She polished cutlery until it looked like another kind of mirror. And she learned the lines of the house in a manner that felt like a small, useful map. She noticed where each guest liked to sit, who preferred black coffee, and who asked for lemon. But it was impossible not to notice Clarissa. Clarissa filled rooms like a punctuation mark. She could be charming when the hour rewarded charm, quick smiles at charity galas, tight-lipped praise when it suited her image, but she could be merciless with the staff. The staff told stories about Clarissa in the way people tell small, sharp myths, whispering about orders given with a glance, about a hung coat left in public as a lesson, about a shower turned off midstream in plain punishment. There had been rumors in the staff room blossoming like mold. An incident at a boutique, a rumor about a young worker who had left a job abruptly, bits of gossip that the senior housekeepers folded into the same worried hush they used to talk about storms. But no one said anything in front of Chica. Even those who admired him for his decency kept their mouths shut when he passed through the kitchen at dawn. Nothing is as dangerous as truth in a household where walls have ears and pride is currency. One morning, a bracelet went missing. It had been Clarissa's, thin, gold, and twisted with small stones that caught the light in a way that made them look alive. The house was a small theater of suspicion. Clarissa announced a search with the calm intensity of someone declaring a national emergency. Drawers were opened, linens were rifled through, the grounds were combed. A maid who had worked in an upstairs room was sent below to the laundry with fingers trembling and head bowed. Clarissa's voice was a low blade. There were names that slipped from her tongue like pebbles. "Who took it?" she demanded. Her eyes swept the room like a hawk measuring prey. "Which one of you handled my things?" There was no accusation that did not carry its own sharpness. If you were poor, or worse, you spoke with the slow cadence of someone who had not eaten well that day, you became, in Clarissa's method of thought, an easier target. The staff knew that arguments over small things rarely ended with solutions. They ended with a person who could no longer see themselves as safe. Amaka stood by the sink, her fingers folded around a tea towel, watching. She had not touched the bracelet. She had not wanted to be anywhere near the conversation. But Clarissa's voice landed like a stone and began to ripple. Those who knew Clarissa's patterns, those who had for years waited on small kindnesses that came with strings, felt the old panic return. A housekeeper began to stammer, then stopped. A footman looked at his shoes as if a clue might crawl out from the grain of leather. The search became a show. Clarissa made a small circle of accusation and walked in it with a triumphant rhythm, waiting for someone to confess or for someone to become visibly guilty. She had the look of someone who believed in traps more than in remedies. When Clarissa accused someone of theft, the staff's instinct was deeply practical. Keep calm, comply, minimize. Confessions could be negotiated into less punishment if they were given quickly. But Clarissa did not always want quick confessions. Often she wanted drama. Often she wanted the person's face to break in public. This is the way humiliation works. It is performed so that everyone who watches learns how to be tiny. That morning, the drama escalated. Clarissa's accusations sharpened, and one junior maid, pale with fear, began to cry. The air filled with the low, knitted worry of people who had seen similar scenes before. Someone reached for the crying girl's elbow to lead her away. It was then Clarissa raised her hand, slowly, deliberately, as if to reward a moment of theatricality with violence. She had hit before. She had found the quick slap and effective final flourish in her arsenal of control. The staff had repaired themselves around it and gone on. The moment became a cautionary tale told in the quiet places where staff dried their hands. But this time, something was different. This time, there was a new pair of hands in the line of sight. Hands that had learned to hold a broom and to mend a tear, and had also learned in a hard school how to hold steadiness under pressure. Amaka reacted the way someone does when they discover the wrongness of an act and cannot live with being a silent witness. She closed the distance with 2 small steps and took Clarissa's wrist. The sound that followed was not loud. It was the sound of a world pausing. Clarissa's hand stopped midair. Her eyes burned with white rage. It was as if, in that room, history had split into 2 lanes, one in which Clarissa's authority was absolute, the other in which a worker dared to name that authority as fallible. "You don't strike the staff," Amaka said, her voice low but steady. She did not sound like a leader. She sounded like someone who had measured the cost of silence and found it heavier than the cost of speaking. The room did not know what to do with the sentence. People who have been trained to shrink cannot immediately learn to stand. The junior maid looked up through wet lashes, stunned. The cooks, who had once memorized every demand of every mistress in the house, looked at their hands as if they had belonged to strangers. Even the butler, the person the house trusted to smooth things over, clenched his jaw in uncertainty and did not speak. Clarissa's face changed under the pressure of not being obeyed. Offensive fury became a kind of disbelief. To be stopped was, in her world, a betrayal. "How dare you?" she started. Her voice carried the brittle edges of someone who had not known being denied. "You will not hit her," Amaka said again. The words were simple, not theatrical. They held no righteous shout. They held no claim to moral superiority. They were, instead, small and accurate. A refusal, a boundary. For the first time in the house, someone else's moral line had been drawn in plain sight. Chica stepped forward then. He had been watching from the doorway, uncertain whether to intervene and wary of making the wrong move. He had watched Clarissa fashion moments of petty cruelty, and he had, in private, asked why people could not be kinder. He had never seen a staff member stop her. He looked at Amaka's hand on Clarissa's wrist, at the small, steady grip. There was no grand speech, only a look. He reached for a calm that fit his nature rather than to amplify the moment. "Let her go," he said to Clarissa, but the plea was not for Clarissa, it was a command for balance. It was the kind of voice that had always kept staff from feeling they must turn their lives into apologies. Clarissa jerked her arm. She twisted free with a small, fierce motion and took a step back as if wounded. The guests who had gathered, people from other houses, acquaintances of Clarissa, sat frozen, glued to a narrative unfolding more public than any of them had intended. Mama Tisa arrived before anyone else could call for her. Mama Tisa was a compact woman with hands like the bridge of an old wooden bench, strong and marked by years of work. Her face was lined as if she had been carved by the world's small troubles and had kept a stern kindness as her default. She had once run a small training school for domestic staff, and rumor had it she had once been the person Clarissa's mother trusted with a child who could not be kept in place. She walked straight into the center of the hush, and every eye, even Clarissa's, turned. Mama Tisa knew Clarissa not as a fiancée or as an image, but as a girl who had learned a certain method of rising. Sharp words, sharp actions, a practiced disregard for those beneath her. She had the authority of someone who had seen patterns before and could name them without anger. "Clarissa," Mama Tisa said, and the single syllable carried the weight of all the small things she had held back for years. "This house will not be made by fear." Clarissa's laugh was brittle and too loud. "Mama Tisa," she said, as if the name itself were a relic, "we do not tolerate slander. These people—" "They are people," Mama Tisa cut in, the words falling like measured stones. "And being rich does not make you right. Being loved by a man with a name does not give you leave to lift your hand against someone who serves you." Her voice was not a sermon, it was an account. It did not demand salvation for Clarissa, it demanded recognition. For a moment, Clarissa's face flickered with confusion, anger laced with something less articulate. A memory, a knot. The staff watched with the thin, hopeful curiosity of people seeing a habit interrupted. The household manager, who had long navigated the treacherous landscape between masters and staff, tried to smooth things. "Madam Clarissa, we can discuss this." "No," Clarissa snapped. Her composure snapped like a twig. "This is a— humiliation is never private," Mama Tisa said simply. She did not raise her voice to match Clarissa's. What she offered was steadiness. "And you once promised to learn a better way." There was a silence thick with the sense that something old had been touched. Mama Tisa's words landed with the weight of a ledger opened after years. Clarissa's shoulders trembled for a fraction of a second. The tightness around her eyes softened just enough to suggest a memory pressed under skin. People who knew Clarissa's history, those with longer tenure in service, felt a coldness lengthen in their chests. There had been, years before, a rumor. Not a tidy scandal, but a small story passed over kettles and under breath. A girl who had died in a house where Clarissa had once been allowed to wield her temper with fewer consequences. No one said the name aloud. To say it would be to pull open old wounds that were not theirs to cut. Clarissa laughed then, a brittle, defensive sound. "You will not," she began, but stepped away. The gesture was not exactly retreat. It was a recalibration. Chico watched and measured. He could see the tremor of something at the edges of Clarissa's composure. He could also see the truth in Mama Tisa's voice. He had a choice then. A choice that would be watched by the staff and mapped into their memories. He could let this dissolve into a private argument and then carry on with the evening, or he could, with a small and decisive action, refuse the theater of humiliation that Clarissa had made into a rule. He put out his hand to the junior maid, not to smooth everything over, but to offer an acknowledgement that small brutalities would not be accepted as the norm in his house. His hand on the maid's shoulder was a minor gesture of protection, but for people who had been taught to live in the margins, minor gestures can mean a great deal. Clarissa moved away from the center of the room, and then, in a rush of color and frenzy, accused someone she thought had stolen her bracelet. She began barking orders again, louder now, covering the earlier crack in her armor with the noise of dominance. The search resumed. People were sent to show their hands, to empty pockets and apron strings. The house began to constrict. In the servants' wing, whispers traveled like a current. There were looks thrown at Amaka, some of them wary, some of them grateful, some of them curious. No one wanted to be the next to be singled out. Amaka felt the weight of all those eyes for a second, and then turned back to her tasks. She had not sought an act of heroism. She had simply found herself unable to step aside while cruelty made a spectacle. Her hands were still a little trembling when she smoothed the tablecloth later, but underneath that tremor was a strange bright light, the knowledge that she had refused to be silent. Later in the small hours, she sat on the narrow cot in the servants' room and closed her eyes. Her muscles had not stopped knowing that their work mattered. Yet neither had she stopped feeling the memory of Clarissa's hand in the air. She thought of home, of a brother who had a cough in the evenings, of her mother who had told her to keep her head and to keep her hands clean. Her action had not been a rebellion as much as a refusal to accept something she did not believe in. It had cost her nothing and everything at once. News travels differently in a house like this. By morning, the story had taken a new shape. The fiancé had been stopped. The billionaire had looked on. It became, in the way gossip makes heroes and villains, a small legend. Some staff circled Amaka, tentatively, as if not entirely certain she belonged to them now or to a new world where things might shift. The butler nodded at her once, a quick, private sign of approval. Mama Tisa passed by and tapped her hand on Amaka's shoulder with a small smile that was almost a benediction. Clarissa, on the other hand, left for an appointment with tightened lips. She returned with a face set like a mask, eyes that did not speak truth. The house watched her as if she were a caged thing. The brittle calm did not last long. One afternoon, she returned to find a small collection of servants gathered for a simple ritual of washing silver, and in a flash, she decided the bracelet was missing for a reason far beyond carelessness. There was an edge in her voice now that suggested plans, not simple punishment. She began to speak of security. She began to suggest measures that felt like a tightening net. Cameras? More oversight? She talked of loyalty as if it were a commodity to be weighed and traded. The staff felt the net close again. People who had breathed easier when Chica was present found their chests tighten under the new air. Clarissa's method had evolved from small incidents into the threat of systems. Proof in pixels and in private recordings, a way to make doubt into a permanent record. Amaka kept her head down. She did her work, careful and precise. She learned the exact curve of the silverware drawer, the precise number of tiles to sweep in the hallway. Small rituals became her armor. Yet the bracelet remained missing, and that absence became a meter that measured the house's mood. One evening, as the household prepared for a formal dinner, Clarissa produced the accusation in front of guests. She did it like a test, like a demonstration. She placed the blame before the assembled staff with a theatricality that left no room for mediation. It was here that the sequence of events turned on that single, decisive gesture, her hand raised, poised to teach. And then Amaka stepped into the arc of that hand and held it. Silence, thick and entire, filled the room. The butler, the chefs, the guards, everyone who had learned to play a role in this place saw the rupture and felt at once the possibility of change and the danger it might bring. For those who had been taught that a master's hand was law, Amaka's action was a small heresy. For those who had been quiet their entire lives, it was something like a map. Not everyone felt immediate relief. Fear did not evaporate. The people in power often doubled down when confronted. Clarissa's eyes flashed, and for a moment, something like grief softened her face. She looked at Amaka in a different way, no longer like a shadow to be commanded, but like a problem to be solved. Mama Tisa had edged closer, and in a voice that was quiet but heavy with memory, said things that suggested a history between Clarissa and consequences. That was not the first time, Mama Tisa said later, not wanting to make a scene but no longer able to hold the quiet. She told the others, softly in the servants' room, about a girl who had once worked where Clarissa had been a young woman living with a freedom she had not understood. The story was not told like a gossip, it was told like a caution. The words moved through the staff like a cold wind. They did not reveal the full truth. This was not their place to sing all at once, but they carried enough to make the air taste different. Clarissa grew quieter after that. She made tight phone calls in her room. She walked with a new kind of precision when she moved through the house, as if she had learned that some actions ripple back in ways she could not control. But the outward edges of her behavior sharpened in other ways. Mistrust became policy, orders grew more exacting, and the culture of proof, photographs, logs, inventory spread through the house like the beginning of a legal code. Chica watched all of it. He had not been blind to Clarissa's faults, but love had a way of softening the edges. He believed, perhaps, in the idea that people could change. He felt now the pull between protecting the woman he cared for and protecting the people who kept his household alive. It was a delicate balance, and the scales tilted without an easy hand. The staff's confidence, fragile as it was, felt bolstered by the knowledge that someone had stood up. They began to speak in small, careful ways, to leave work a little later, to fold a uniform with a small extra care, to accept an offer of tea with a small, tentative laugh. For the first time, some of them imagined a world in which persistent little cruelties did not go unanswered. And yet, for all the change that seemed possible, the bracelet had not been found. The house's rituals merely rearranged themselves around the missing piece. Rumors pulled at the edges of every morning. Clarissa's anger found new outlets. She made quiet decisions, and people felt them like gusts of wind. The staff wondered whether the small victory they had witnessed, Amaka's hand stopping a slap, was enough to alter the mansion's future, or whether it was merely a bright, transient thing that would be absorbed back into the old order. One evening, as rain ticked at the windows and the house gathered itself for sleep, a voice rose at the gate. The night watchman, a steady man with a round face, closed the iron latch and peered out. He saw a figure standing in the rain, a stranger who looked like a man with purpose. He called for the manager. The manager came and hesitated. To open the gate at night was a decision that could ripple. Mama Tisa, who had been sitting in the kitchen with a cup of tea, heard the commotion and, as if summoned by some knowledge she had been carrying for years, moved towards the front. The rest of the house felt a small tightening, an awareness that whatever was coming to the gate might not be merely another visitor asking for directions. The figure at the gate was neither a friend nor a simple errand runner. He stood under the rain with an expression that had lived with a long, private hurt. The watchman called his name for verification, and when it came, the one who said it felt like the fastening of a new seam. The man would not be turned away. The manager's hand hovered over the intercom. He took a breath as if the weight of what he might let in could change all their lives. Inside the house, the people who had gathered near the foyer felt their breaths align. Something was coming through the gate that would force the house to reckon with its past in a new way. Amaka, who was folding linens a little above the staff room, paused with a towel in her hand. She had not asked for this, but bravery, once used, invites further tests. Outside, the man steadied himself and looked toward the house as if it held, in its stone bones, an answer to an old question. The rain made his hair slick, and his posture was a kind of careful demand. The gate, tall and iron, stood between him and the house's heart. The latch clicked. The manager spoke his name and prepared to open. At the gateway of the mansion, a single action unfolded like the hinge on a door. The man spoke again, this time with greater urgency. Inside, the chandelier's light winked like a distant shore. The people in the house felt the moment as one might feel the first syllable of a sentence that promises a great truth. They had already seen something change when a maid arrested a hand mid-air. They were about to find whether the past would be allowed to remain hidden or whether it would come in to claim the present. The gate opened. The gate opened. Rain traced pale rivers down the stone. The man who stepped inside kept his shoulders square against the weather, the kind of posture shaped by long months, years of carrying a private ruin. He moved through the courtyard like someone who had rehearsed a short, necessary truth. The staff formed a line of breath and shadow. The house watched him as if it were watching a test it had not studied for. Samuel Okoro, he said, when the manager finally leaned out. His voice was level, not theatrical. I came to find Clarissa Benson. The name landed like a stone. Clarissa, who had been trying to recompose her poise in a powder room by a folding mirror, heard it and went still. She had been moving through the evening as if she were both a costume and a command. Now the costume creased. Her mouth tightened. For a second, she was only the woman people had always said looked made of glass, ready to break into pieces small and expensive. Chica listened from the foyer with his palms at his sides, as if considering whether this was a moment to open his hands or to close them. The gate opened. The gate opened. Rain traced pale rivers down the stone. The man who stepped inside kept his shoulders square against the weather, the kind of posture shaped by long months, years of carrying a private ruin. He moved through the courtyard like someone who had rehearsed a short, necessary truth. The staff formed a line of breath and shadow. The house watched him as if it were watching a test it had not studied for. Samuel Okoro, he said, when the manager finally leaned out. His voice was level, not theatrical. I came to find Clarissa Benson. The name landed like a stone. Clarissa, who had been trying to recompose her poise in a powder room by a folding mirror, heard it and went still. She had been moving through the evening as if she were both a costume and a command. Now the costume creased. Her mouth tightened. For a second, she was only the woman people had always said looked made of glass, ready to break into pieces small and expensive. Chica listened from the foyer with his palms at his sides, as if considering whether this was a moment to open his hands or to close them. He stepped forward deliberately and signaled the manager to admit Samuel. It was a quiet permission, but the sort that rewired the room. For those who had lived on the edge of orders and consequences, a billionaire's small decision can feel like law. Samuel walked to the center of the room as if through a ring of small suns. He did not shout. He did not lace his words with theatrical flourish. He spoke in a voice steadied by grief. My sister died, he said. The words were neither a plea nor a flourish of accusation. They were a fact laid down like a plank that needed to be crossed. She worked for this family years ago. She was... He stopped, then went on. I came because I was told Clarissa Benson had something to do with what happened. The room exhaled as one organism. The staff tightened around Samuel's words like people drawn together against cold. Chica watched Samuel and then looked towards Clarissa. He had suspected tension. He had not imagined this specific history would re-emerge like a tide. Clarissa's voice was thin when she answered. You cannot. This is a private matter. We are engaged. You cannot buy a life's memory with a ring, Samuel interrupted quietly. There was a controlled fire in him that made his grief plain but not performative. I am not here for spectacle. I want truth. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of rain hitting the windows and the tick of a clock somewhere in the house. Then Clarissa moved. First a step, then another, a reed bending in the wind of accusation. She tried to explain, at first in clipped sentences about misunderstandings and bad luck. Her hands did the thing they had always done when she wanted to contain a narrative. She summoned receipts of grievance and lists of supposed loyalty. But Samuel did not move. He did not demand an apology. He asked for accountability. You will hear what I have to say, he told Chica, and his eyes met the billionaire's. Because my sister is gone. The name of the dead girl was not spoken by any of the staff. Grief held its privacy. But the presence of her absence was thick and visible, a stain on a tablecloth that could not be washed away. It was then that a small, ordinary accident became a lever. Clarissa, flustered, reached into her evening bag for a handkerchief, and her phone slid, bright and glass, onto the marble. The screen flicked in the light, and someone, one of the guards, knelt to pick it up. In that movement, 100 private things could have remained private. But phones are strange things in a house like that. Their small bright screens carry messages that do not stay in pockets. The guard handed the device to the manager, who, out of habit or curiosity, glanced at the screen. There, tucked in the messages, were lines that read like a plan. Names, times, instructions to create doubt, the words Plan B were visible beside an audio file icon. For a second, the manager thought it a mistake. Then he saw the string of text that followed, calculating and cold. If he hesitates, use the binding. Make concern a scandal. Keep the girl afraid. He will sign. Someone said, "What is that?" as if the air itself had become a question. Chica took the phone without a flourish. He was not acting from a place of spectacle either. He placed the device on his palm as if to examine an object more than a person's soul. He tapped it, and the room clustered near like people at a map. The recording began. Clarissa's voice, casual and clipped, filled the air in a way that made the room tilt. It was not an outburst, it was a planning session. "We will make him think he's losing control," the voice said, calm and measured. "If he doubts the loyalty of his staff, he will look to me as the only anchor. If the bracelet incident gets messy, we escalate. Plan B is to secure the papers. If he stalls, bring in the footage. If that fails, we use..." The rest of the sentence hung like a shadow. Chica's jaw tightened. Mama Tisa, who had come forward to stand at Samuel's side, made no sound but folded her hands like a prayer. The staff listened as one who had all along kept a ledger in the quiet places. The recording read as a ledger's balance. Premeditation, manipulation, a pattern rather than a one-off cruelty. Clarissa's face moved through colors quickly. First denial in a high, brittle pitch, then a fumbling attempt to explain, then a flush of fear that made the hand she had used to touch makeup shake. "You're playing a trick," she said. "Someone's edited that." "Play it again," Samuel said softly. There was no show in it. There was only a request for clarity. Chica hit play again. The audio was rawer this time. The voice on the file spoke of leverage with a small professional cruelty. Certain moments could be exaggerated, certain conversations could be twisted. "If we make them doubt the maid's story, he will rely on me for the narrative," the voice suggested. "We keep the staff off balance. We control the narrative, and when it is time, we press for the settlement. Whatever he signs, we secure." "That's blackmail," said the butler, his voice low and finally registered by those who had not yet permitted themselves to name injustice. The word landed like an accusation, and not only toward Clarissa, but toward a system that could be turned into a weapon by a single hand. Clarissa's face cracked then, not with melodrama, but with the small collapse of a person pushed beyond the point where pretense can hold. She said things quickly, poorly chosen and desperate, that she had been misunderstood, that the messages had been manipulated, that people had edited conversations. She accused the staff of scheming. She looked at her father, Chief Benson, with something that was less like anger and more like pleading. "Father," she said, "say something." Chief Benson had arrived in the doorway like a man called from a private room. He had been a figure of quiet authority, a large man with a face that had softened and hardened with years alike. He now looked like a man startled awake. For a while, he did not speak. The house had known him as the father of the woman whose impatience had made the staff flinch. No one had expected him to speak truth into the gathering. Chief Benson stepped into the center of the room. He had the air of a man holding a ledger of his own and deciding to open it. He did not reach for excuses. "There was a girl," he said, his voice carrying a tiredness that made the words feel heavy. She worked in a house where my daughter lived when she was younger. She was small, quick, always smiling. There were incidents, small things, to those with money. My daughter had fits of temper. Some called them lessons. I called them mistakes, and then I helped us forget them. He swallowed, as if something lodged in him. She fell ill, and in the end there was no one there who could tell the truth. We moved on. We wrapped it up with our money and our apologies. I was wrong. I thought my resources could shield what needed to be faced. A silence followed that made the house feel like the space after a ledger's books are laid on a table. The staff listened as if to a long, withheld sentence finally being made public. Samuel's shoulders trembled with something. Anger, yes, but mostly an old grief finding shape in the air. Chief Benson's confession did not add lurid detail. He did not invent harm beyond what he knew. He said only that inaction had cost a life, and that he, in his attempt to preserve the family's name, let the truth be buried. His voice had the brittle quality of a man who had carried a complicity he no longer wished to keep. "I am sorry," he said simply, "for the girl, for my silence, for the way we treated people as if their worth was less than the outlines of our comforts. I am sorry." Mama Tisa pressed her lips together and let out a single breath that was like the closing of a wound. She had known, in a way only those who live close to labor know, the cycles that breed such tragedies. She had seen Clarissa once, years ago, a child learning to guard herself with a sharpness that would harden into cruelty. She had tried to teach restraint and responsibility. In the end, she had been ignored. Now the lesson had come back like a debt. For Clarissa, the admission by her father produced an unraveling that was composed of small things. The failure of words to stand, the sudden shrinking of privilege in the face of fact. She tried legalistic deflection, claims of editing, of misinterpretation. But the recording, the messages, and her father's confession formed a net too tight to shimmy out of. Chica watched all of this with a face that moved slowly from hurt to something firmer. There was a measure in him that never loved spectacle. He had been slow to anger. He was not slow to judgment when facts aligned. "I am sorry," he said simply, "for the girl, for my silence, for the way we treated people as if their worth was less than the outlines of our comforts. I am sorry." Mama Tisa pressed her lips together and let out a single breath that was like the closing of a wound. She had known, in a way only those who live close to labor know, the cycles that breed such tragedies. She had seen Clarissa once, years ago, a child learning to guard herself with a sharpness that would harden into cruelty. She had tried to teach restraint and responsibility. In the end, she had been ignored. Now the lesson had come back like a debt. For Clarissa, the admission by her father produced an unraveling that was composed of small things. The failure of words to stand, the sudden shrinking of privilege in the face of fact. She tried legalistic deflection, claims of editing, of misinterpretation. But the recording, the messages, and her father's confession formed a net too tight to shimmy out of. Chica watched all of this with a face that moved slowly from hurt to something firmer. There was a measure in him that never loved spectacle. He had been slow to anger. He was not slow to judgment when facts aligned. He listened to Samuel's short, economical plea for truth and to Chief Benson's admission, and he felt the scale tip in a direction he could not ignore. "Police," he said finally, to no one in particular, the single word feeling like a bridge between the private and the civic. The manager, who had hoped this evening would not escalate past the scandal, made a call with shaking hands. Within minutes, officers in plain uniforms arrived at the gate, professional, compact, their presence thin but decisive. The house that had once tried to contain its own transgressions now had the legal system moving into its rooms. Clarissa fought in a way that was both theatrical and cornered. She demanded privacy, she demanded apologies, she accused Samuel of sensationalism. But the officers asked for a statement, and she found herself in a room with bright bulbs and not enough defenses. She answered questions in a voice that quivered between defiance and implosion. They read her rights, they noted the recording, the messages, they wrote down the events and took a formal statement from Samuel. They took notes from Chief Benson and from those staff who were willing to speak. The language used, complaint, evidence, allegation, was clinical, and it cut through the fog of the house like a blade made of procedure. Chica stood in the foyer as the officers did their work. His decision was not theatrical. He did not rally a crowd or make a speech. He simply faced Clarissa with a steadiness that came from having watched the system he was part of be used as a weapon. He took out his phone and made one call, then placed the device in his pocket and looked at Clarissa. "I won't marry you," he said, in a voice that was steady and small and utterly decisive. There was no flourish of dramatic heartbreak. There was instead a clear, practical refusal that felt like a folding of a treaty. I cannot ask people to be part of our lives when the lives of others have been made so small. The wedding is off. Those words released an atmosphere that had been taut like a drum. Some staff wept quietly. Others exhaled in a way that suggested a physical relaxation they had not known was possible. Samuel's shoulders lowered as if a weight had been transferred from his chest to an official desk where it could be counted and acted upon. Clarissa's denial hardened into rage and then into a quieter panic. The officers explained that they would need to take her statement at the station and that she might be required to answer further questions. They did not shout, they did their job, methodical and insulated against drama. Clarissa, once the domain of arrogance and command, was being handled by forms and processes. Before she left, Chief Benson did something small and public. He went to the staff quarters and stood at their doorway, as if to cross a line he had long avoided. He did not make speeches, he did not ask forgiveness in ornate ways. He placed a hand on the shoulder of the maid who had cried in that earlier incident and looked at her with a kind of humble shame. "I was wrong," he said, to the staff and to the household that had watched their lives be adjusted around his family's comforts. "I will do what I can to set this right." Mama Tisa, whose steadiness had been the fixed point in the house for years, found a chair and sat with her hands folded. She offered no grand vindication. She performed a small ceremony of acknowledgement. She named the girl who had died and asked, in a voice threaded with old grief, for a moment of silence. The house observed. The staff, who had long carried the silent ledger of small cruelties, felt a kind of validation in the light of public admission. Samuel, when it was his turn to speak, did not demand scandal. He said simply that he wanted the truth to be known and for institutions to answer, to not allow a life to be wrapped away in quiet. "I do not want more blood," he said quietly, meaning he did not want revenge. "I want accountability. I want the law to take its course." Chica nodded. He did not make promises to heal all wounds with money or gestures. He arranged for legal counsel to be available to the staff who wished to speak and asked that the house cooperate fully with the investigation. It was a material step, not a theatrical sweep. The officers took notes, statements were filed. Clarissa was escorted by police to their vehicle, and the house watched the departure of someone who had once walked in like a storm. There was no parade. There was no triumphant shout. The healing the house needed was practical and slow. Chica invited the staff to a meeting in the morning where they would be able to speak freely to a mediator and where adjustments in practices would begin. He authorized measures to ensure the staff had access to legal counsel and counseling services. He asked Mama Tisa to coordinate with local agencies who could offer support. The actions were small but systematic. A change in scheduling so people would not be overburdened. A new transparent system for inventory and security that did not rely on suspicion. A written code about acceptable behavior. The law would do its work, the family would change theirs. In the days that followed, the mood in the mansion shifted like weather after a storm. People went about their work with a different gait. Some tentative, some braced, some with a cautious optimism. The butler, once the person who smoothed each wrinkle in the household's life, led a meeting where staff could voice grievances and requests. Mama Tisa held a quiet circle and told stories about respect in the old way, how dignity is shown in the daily acts of honesty and steadiness. Amaka found herself at the center of small, private gestures that were not meant to make her a spectacle. Chica called her to the study one afternoon and offered a quiet thanks. He did not make it about a headline. He brought a letter, simple and sincere, of appreciation, and suggested a raise that would make a difference not as charity but as fair recompense. He spoke of trust in a way that was modest. You did what was right, he said, not because you wanted praise, but because you would not stand by. That matters to me. Amaka took the letter with fingers that had not expected such things. She did not make a speech. She simply bowed her head and said, in words that carried the dignity of someone who had always known the value of work, "Thank you, sir." The exchange was small and private, an acknowledgement not of hero worship, but of recognition that systems change when ordinary people act. Chief Benson, who had to live with the quiet knowledge of his failure, began to visit organizations that supported workers. He spoke about his regret not as a performance, but as a practice, how he would use his resources to set up a fund for families who had suffered because of negligence and silence. The gesture could not erase the past, but it was a committed effort to redirect power into repair rather than evasion. Mama Tisa continued to be a steady presence. She walked through the kitchens and sat with the staff at odd hours, listening, advising, ensuring that stories were heard. She was not a fix-all. She was a witness. For those who had been small for so long, being witnessed mattered. Samuel returned to the gate with a measured human lightness that was not triumph but relief. He had sought something that carried his sister's name into a space where it had once been silenced. The road forward would be legal and uncertain, but it would be public. When he spoke to staff in the small room where tea was served after dinner, he did not flare. He offered thanks. He also said that he would be there if anyone needed to speak about the past. His presence, steady and unromantic, had shifted a truth into the light. Clarissa's departure from the household did not erase the scars she had left. Some staff took time to feel safe again, some left the house for other work, some stayed to mend what had been broken. The mansion, so often a monument to a single family's image, began to reweave itself as a place where rituals of accountability mattered as much as place settings. In one of his quieter moments, Chica walked the corridors alone and paused where Amaka had once smoothed a linen. He thought of the ease of living inside wealth's blinders and the hard work of unblinding oneself. He felt responsibility in a way that was not moralistic but practical. People who serve deserve protection that does not depend on celebrity or whispered fortune. He resolved to make the house a place with clearer lines and firmer protections, not for display, but because life requires structures that withstand the small cruelties of habit. Weeks later, when the weather had become gentle and the household had found a new cadence, Mama Tisa gathered a small group by the kitchen hearth. They did not call it a ceremony. They called it a telling, where the staff spoke of what had been and what they hoped would be. Chief Benson stood quietly at the edge, listening. Chica sat in the doorway, hands folded. Samuel attended as a representative of the truth that had been brought in from the rain. Amaka sat among them the way one sits after doing something inevitable but costly, quietly, chosen. She did not let the attention make her proud or swollen. She let it be a thing that happened and that had ripple effects beyond one household. People told her thank you in simple ways: a borrowed sweater with mended seams, a message to home carried by a friend, an invitation to stay longer in the position with better terms. None of those things turned her life into a different genre. They changed practicalities and opened small doors. The house began to hold a different sound. Conversations that were not always strategic or fearful, but sometimes ordinary, about children's school books, about a pot left on the stove, about a neighbor's cow. That ordinariness was, in time, its own kind of restoration. It meant that the staff could again make choices that were mundane and freeing. A day off to visit a sick parent, a small gathering at the weekend. The healing would not be instantaneous. It would not erase what had been lost. It would, however, mean that the house had been forced to account for itself. At the very end, Chica sought Amaka out again, not for a public commendation, but for something quieter. He found her folding linens in an afternoon light, the room smelling of soap and sun. He stood in the doorway for a moment and then crossed the threshold. "Amaka," he said. It was not a sentence built for an audience. "Thank you for not being silent." She looked up. For a second, the room narrowed, and both of them sat with the simplicity of what had occurred. She answered with a modestness that could have been mistaken for shyness, but was, in fact, the language of someone who knew the weight of small acts. "I did what I could," she said. "Someone had to stop it." Chica shook his head, the movement a small correction. "You did more than stop it. You made the house remember. That matters." She accepted his gratitude with a small, steady nod. There was no grand reward given, no fever of publicity. There was a change in the way people were scheduled and paid and listened to. There was a fund set up by Chief Benson. There were new protocols for complaints and an open-door policy for the staff to speak. There were also quieter things: a cup of tea left for the night watchman, a coat mended without fuss, a child's school book bought without questions. The story of that night spread outside the walls, not as a scandal to be devoured, but as a cautionary tale and a small example of accountability. People outside the house discussed what it meant for power to be questioned, for wealth to be held to simple law. Some criticized, some applauded. But for those inside the house, chiefly the staff and the family, the change was a slow work of rebuilding trust and boundaries. Time does not wipe the past. The family and the house had to live with what had been revealed and with the legal processes that followed. There would be further statements, interviews, and procedural necessities. The law would decide its course. The household would continue to remake its practices, imperfectly and with effort. Justice in any form is messy and procedural. What was undeniable, however, was the ripple that began with a single steady hand. Amaka's intervention did not fix everything on its own. It set in motion a chain of events: an exposure, a confession, a legal reckoning, and changes in how a powerful household would function. It taught those who watched that courage need not be theatrical to be effective. It can be a quiet refusal to let cruelty pass unnoticed. In the kitchen, Mama Tisa boiled water and hummed a tune she had learned as a child. The staff crowded around in small groups and talked about plans and small hopes, their voices rising and falling like a comfortable sea. Chief Benson worked to make reparation into something practical. Samuel continued his quest for a complete accounting, not out of vengeance, but out of the desire that his sister not be a shadow that could be ignored again. Chica learned that wealth without checks creates a brittle world. He set his hand to make it steadier. Amaka kept her morning rituals: sweeping, folding, listening. She kept the humility she had always had, but with a new steadiness in her step. People began to treat one another with slightly more care. Not everything was healed. The memory of the girl who had died lingered like a quiet bell. But the house had changed its architecture of silence. That alone mattered. Under the same chandelier where a hand had once been arrested midair, the place that had once been merely beautiful began to hold a different light. Not just the glitter of polished surfaces, but the softer luminescence of accountability. A single hand had interrupted a long tide of small cruelties. It had started a process that, imperfect and slow,